The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just touch on a couple of points. First, one, I thought everybody had agreed that the Russian interference alleged in the 2016 campaign had pretty much been debunked, but apparently not. I heard it here today just a few seconds ago.
Will the gentleman yield first?
I will not yield. I would say, in addition, that the mail ballots in D.C., I have a friend who lives up here, as you might know, several of us do, and they received multiple opportunities to vote. They obviously didn't exercise that. And in that regard, I would ask General Cuccinelli, we have heard today that the Heritage Election Fraud Database shows no cases of fraud in D.C. Do you have an explanation why that might be?
Certainly do, as the nature of the system in D.C. is very poor. So catching it in the first place is much more difficult. There are other jurisdictions that do a much better job of that. But I will also tell you, as a former Attorney General, that no one bothers to put those cases together when you have an office like the D.C. Council's office, which it would take a near miracle for them to bring a voter fraud case. So when you don't have a prosecutor behind you who will actually bring the case, you don't put the case together. So people need to understand that context.
All right. Let me switch gears because I've heard all about D.C. statehood. As those who study history know, D.C. was originally created to form a city that did not, or a location for the federal government to locate that would not give advantage to any one state, and it was created out of land from both Maryland and the Commonwealth of Virginia, our home state Attorney General. And so I've thought about this problem because the city's a lot larger than it was when it was originally founded, and there are a lot of permanent residents. And so for a number of years now, I've introduced a retrocession bill because when Virginia took back, or when the people in Virginia decided they didn't want to be a part of D.C. and everybody thought that was okay, they were given back to the Commonwealth of Virginia, and so Alexandria and parts of Arlington were originally a part of D.C. So I've had a retrocession bill in for some time, and I have one that would then take everything except the federal complexes and put it into the state of Maryland. Is this something that you think is appropriate? And while you're at it, let's talk about the constitutionality, because I've questioned whether the Virginia retrocession was constitutional. And clearly, if it was, then a retrocession of the territory currently located within the District of Columbia that originally belonged to Maryland could be also retrocessed or given back to the state of Maryland. And then all of those folks would have the opportunity to vote for a congressional person and would no longer have the feeling that they've been cut out, because I think they've got some legitimate concerns there, except that it was never intended to create a new state. It was always supposed to have been coming out of these two territories. And so that, to me, seems to be the better historical and constitutional answer. Would you agree and opine on that?
Yeah, I agree on both counts. First of all, that it is constitutional. Second of all, that it is not only appropriate by opinion, it's appropriate by history. That's what happened on the Virginia side of the river. That's what should happen on the Maryland side of the river. And the founding generation that put the law in place to originally establish the 10-mile by 10-mile District of Columbia is viewed by courts as more, because they also wrote the Constitution. James Madison was noted as being involved in the formation of the District of Columbia where it is, also wrote the Constitution. The courts view laws passed at that time as more closely connected to the founding and thus more likely constitutional, and the acts of this body start with a presumption of constitutionality to begin with. So then you fast forward to 1846 when Virginia got its property back, if you will, or its portion of the land back, and with no challenge. And so that is, in my view, it'd be a layup constitutionally to for your bill to pass constitutional muster, as it's already been done in both directions.
But I would be correct if it were deemed by the Supreme Court not to be constitutional, then you would have to take those portions of Virginia and put them back into the District of Columbia before you move forward.
Yeah, it is all or nothing, yes.
That's correct. So if they were to create statehood, it would only be appropriate that Alexandria and parts of Arlington would be returned to D.C. for statehood purposes as well, would it not?
That logically, yes, but the more historically appropriate course is for each state to get its territory back minus the federal buildings.
And let me just clarify on the challenge that we heard earlier. Challenges to electors in the body is based on law and the 12th Amendment. And it's interesting because there's a statement from Abraham Lincoln when electors were challenged in 1865 from the 1864 election. and that many people on both sides of the aisle have voted for challenges over the years, including my colleague who raised the issue. And I don't know what the folks who were storming the Capitol were thinking, but there were many of us who believed that what we were doing was following the Constitution, and so did the unanimous Supreme Court. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.